Vivek, thank you for telling us now. You could have done it also 20 minutes ago.
What the hell, Vivek ke
sir,
bachche?
we are live now. We are live now. We are live now.
So, should we start now?
Yes, ma'am.
Please do.
All right. Good evening, dear viewers. On behalf of the Military Literature Festival Committee, I welcome you to a session titled Major Emerging Lessons from the Russo-Ukrainian War 2022. The cataclysmic war, which began when Russia invaded Ukraine on 24th February 2022, has left behind a trail of death, displacement, and destruction. However, it has also taught us some vital tactical lessons, such as the handling of armor and infantry, logistics, use of man-made portable weapons, communications, information warfare, close air support, timings of launching operations, topography, kinetic warfare, maintenance of aim and momentum, and employment of stay-behind parties and special forces. Tonight, we've co-opted an eminent panel of experienced and highly knowledgeable experts to discuss these vital strategic lessons. This dialogue will be beneficial in enlightening the viewers as well as the armed forces and think tanks like the United Service Institutions and the Gyan Chakra think tank on the key aspects of the Russo-Ukrainian war. I think we can promise the viewers that they will take away valuable educations in planning, strategy, and warfare from tonight's discussion. On the panel are Lieutenant General Satish Dua, PVSM, UYSM, SMVSM. He served as Chief of Integrated Defense Staff to the Chairman of the Chiefs of Staff Committee of the Indian Armed Forces and is the former 15th Corps Commander. The General Officer was the Kashmir Corps Commander during the surgical strikes in 2016. General Satish Dua was the founding member secretary of the Defense Planning Committee. He is also the author of India's Bravehearts, Untold Stories from the Indian Army. Lieutenant General P.R. Shankar, PVSM, AVSM, VSM, retiring as the Director General of Artillery, Lieutenant General Shankar has vast operational experience and has held many important staff, command, and instructional appointments. He contributed significantly to the modernization and the indigenization of artillery and has a deep understanding and experience of successful defense planning and
डन
acquisition.
हटा दिए देखो.
Praveen Swami is a journalist and an author. He specializes in international strategic and security issues. He was the diplomatic editor of the Daily Telegraph, after which he became the national editor of the Indian Express. He is currently the group consulting editor at Network 18. Swami is the author of 2 books on the India-Pakistan conflict in Kashmir. Dr. Peter Caddick Adams is a British academic historian, author, and broadcaster who specializes in military history. He is known for books on 20th century warfare, television work, and battlefield tours. He is currently director of the Defense and Global Security Institute and lectures at the Center of Historical Research, University of Wolverhampton. Moderating today's very exciting session is Lieutenant General KJ Singh, PVSM, par to AVSM and AVSF, a former Western Army commander who, amongst his manifold roles and responsibilities, has served in all insurgency and conflict areas, GNK, JNK, Punjab, NE, and LWE. He has steered key perspective planning, capability building, HR, and defense diplomacy desks in the Army headquarters. He established several security-related think tanks like the Gyan Chakra and the Gyan Field. I invite General KJ Singh to kindly take over the proceedings.
Thank you, Aradhika, and welcome to my co-panelists. I feel very humbled to be in your company. All of you are experts in your respective discussion, let me tell the reminders that it is always dangerous to analyze a conflict when it is going on. And they say, don't try to study or handle a crisis on a ship when it is in a storm. You know, by bringing days, it is the 38th day. So it's necessary that we look at an educated kind of study of this war and try and validate a few of the things that we will try and put it across. And after your questions, you have the liberty to float the comments, and we'll request Military Literature Festival Committee to collect those comments and maybe take it up in the subsequent discussion. So that let's see if they get validated or not. So I, like an opening batsman, I have a tough task. I have to defend something that I have been in love with. You know, I am a armored corps officer, and for 40 years I was on tanks. And this conflict has raised some very serious questions. There are people who are ready, jumping to write the obituary of tanks. They are saying tanks are no longer effective. Are they even required? And see, what has happened is, in the last 2 or 3 conflicts where tanks have been used, in the Azerbaijan conflict, to a certain extent, even in the Syrian war, and now in Ukrainian one, they have not been used in a proper manner. If the Russian plan was to exploit shock and awe, then it had to be supported with maneuver. And maneuver requires cross-country mobility. You cannot execute maneuver on the roads and with a 40-mile or 60-odd kilometer convoys. You have to get off the road. So, well, that has not been possible. We all have to study the phenomena of Rasputista, the mud swamps which are now seen. But the question is that Russians were exercising this area for last 2 months. So have they done it by choice, or has it been forced on them? I cannot give you a clear answer at this stage. There is fog of war. But I will leave this question to you, and I will link it up in my second exposition that I do, that how India got over this problem in 1971 war. And if the maneuver is not taking place, then you are helpless. You are stuck on hard ground. You are not able to invest the cities, isolate them, and you are also being targeted. You means the Russians are also being targeted by anti-tank weapons. So you have Ukrainians using their very basic and rudimentary missiles. I had to Google to find out the name Stugna. And then you also have, Ukrainians also have javelins which have been given to them. And there is an interesting thing. India rejected javelins. So I'll discuss this in my second part. We opted for Spike from Israelis. So here it is anti-tank missiles being used, drones, Bayraktar of Turkish origin being employed against the tanks. So what has happened to the famous active protection system and reactive armor? The questions to this have to be still analyzed. It is not proving so effective. Russians have Shotra active protection system. It seems to be getting defeated because Americans in certain simulation studies had found out an answer which in India is called jugaad or a quick fix solution, that you lace at your target 3 target shots, and then that active protection system doesn't get activated, and then you fire the missile. So has that been employed effectively? That question will have to be analyzed. Because this war is not going to get over for study and students. There will be a lot of examinations and analysis. The other thing is that if you have to fight within cities or towns or urban warfare you want to execute, some part of it will get covered in detail by Jan Satish Dua, who is an expert in this domain. Then you use something called as TUSK or BUS, Tank Urban Survival Kit or Built Up Area Survival Kit, which is an array of cages, slat armor, which deflect the anti-tank missiles. Have they been fielded in large numbers? What is the efficacy of TUS and BUS? And listeners, do pardon me, I seem to be giving you more questions than answering them myself. Because allow me to tell you, I don't have ready answers. I can only share some perspectives and trends with you. So we can help to understand this. But the fact of the matter is that TUS and BUS are not working, and Russians have taken a standoff approach to isolation and investment. They are not getting into, and rightly so, which is a logical thing to do. They are not getting into the urban areas, and they are trying to execute whatever they want to do through attrition. Another worrying trend is that a tank doesn't become a casualty straight away. The casualties have to be categorized. It can be a fighting kill, it can be a mobility kill, it can be a complete kill. You categorize them. You have an F kill, you have an M kill, you have a K kill. So are all these 300 tanks K kills? Well, that is certainly not possible. We have to learn from Israelis. Israelis in their wars propagated a concept of resuscitation of tanks. About 90 Israeli tanks were hit in a day of fighting, and the next day 70 were fielded. So that is the kind of repair or maintenance or resurgence support which has to be provided to armor corps. Another thing which is worth looking at is that while Russians have fielded T-72, T-90 tanks, where are their famous light tanks, struts? Why are they not able to get into swamps and execute some limited maneuvers? So, and the very composition of Russian tank battle groups or tactical battle groups is now under serious question. Because if you have a force of 900 odd soldiers and only 200 are infantrymen, then General Satish Dua will be happy to hear you can achieve nothing. You have to have large number of infantry. They seem to be all into those 50 odd tracked vehicles which are part of that group. So I must leave it out here, and in part 2 I'll take the balance things. I will pass this debate to my worthy colleague, and he is the foremost kind of an exponent on firepower. So let me request Jan Shankar to take it on from now. Thank you, Jan Shankar.
Thanks a lot, sir. Good evening to all the viewers. I thank the Military Literary Festival to call me over for the first time. A very good evening to all panelists. Before I go further, I'd like to show a little presentation and then explain the aspects of firepower. And can the host enable my screen sharing, please? Yeah. Right. They have not been able to do that. But let me go about giving you some major trend lines of firepower and air. As much as armor and infantry have not been employed fully in this operation, that much has been offset by air and artillery and firepower as a whole. What has this battle proved? What has this war proved? It has proved that conventional battle is alive with all its violence, its comeback, right? And firepower has been a major, battle-winning factor, right? And the scope of firepower employment has expanded vastly in this operation. You've seen integrated firepower is the order of the day, right? You couldn't separate between air and missiles and rockets and all. You need to do it integrated. Now, integration, this war has taught us, is between two entities. One is between the sensors and the shooters. The array of sensors have been vast. Drones, LN, air, everything, right? And the shooters have also been vast. We'll touch upon it a little later. Then there's been a great amount of integration between the air and the ground elements of firepower, right? Having said this, if you see, firepower has been used seamlessly, and more importantly, the nuclear and the conventional power has been, used seamlessly in a destructive and a deterrent way, both for destruction and deterrent way, and they've been used interchangeably. Now, this is something at the macro level, a first of its kind, which I've seen in my lifetime, right, at the strategic level. So what has happened is, in terms of firepower, there's a straight underpinning between the tactical level, the operational level, and the strategic level through use of firepower. And here you use hypersonic air, you use hypersonic missiles, you use cruise missiles, you use normal missiles, guided and unguided, rockets and guns. Whole lot, the whole spectrum has been used. General KJ just mentioned, this battle has been largely static if you look at it from a conventional point of view. The way we've all learned how battles are executed, right? It's been static for long periods. In fact, from the second week of March, nothing has moved. The front line has not moved. But long-range firepower has opened the battlefield. It has generated strategic maneuver. Now, this is a new concept which has come all together, which we need to read, right? Every end of Ukraine has been touched by long-range firepower or short-range firepower, right? And another thing, what General KJ said, Rapustita has stopped tanks from moving, infantry from moving cross-country, but it does not stop firepower. Ultimately, what matters is not that you can take a tank to a place or an infantryman to a place, how to destroy the enemy. That the Russians have done well. And so have the Ukrainians. I'll give a couple of examples there also. Now, firepower in this entire story has been used in a calibrated and a coordinated manner to achieve political aims with minimum collateral damage. The Western construct or the normal thing which you get on the media is that there's a hell of a lot of damage happening, but I don't think so. If you look at the casualties, which are civilian casualties which have happened in this war as put out by UN and in the Gulf Wars, you will see the difference, right? It's been quite precise, right? And they've used a theaterized approach. In this, the entire Ukraine is one theater. And this is something which we have to take. It is a large learning for us in the use of integration, jointness, and theaterization. Okay, now let me look at it. I made a statement that political aims was vis-a-vis how firepower has achieved it. Mr. Putin laid down 4 political aims. He's actually outlined them. That's the condition for him to finish the war, and that's the way this whole war has progressed so far. His first one was Ukraine not to be part of NATO, largely. What has he done? He's used the deterrence power of firepower to do that. He's used nuclear threat to keep NATO out. He's used hypersonic missiles in precisely 2 strikes to signal to NATO that we can go through the A2AD systems which NATO has, which General KJ had mentioned. So that's kept NATO out of the game almost totally, right? It's been sidelined. Okay, now when you look at it, the 4th demand which I had was Ukraine to be demilitarized. Now this demilitarization is being done through destruction. I've spoken of deterrence and destruction. When you say look at destruction, we've done it in a layered manner. Air and missile strikes on Ukrainian bases, especially on the Western front, right? Lviv, Zhytomyr, Lutsk, and all military bases where aid can flow through have been taken out. Okay, Russia has systematically destroyed the Ukrainian war-waging capability. Their ammunition, fuel dumps, logistics capabilities have been taken out. Then all the Ukrainian defense industry, right, like the Zoria defense industry, or for that matter, the Antonov airfield has been taken out, and the factories have been taken out, they have been razed, and this has been admitted by the Ukrainians. Okay, and then the destruction of the Ukrainian firepower and all the military elements have been done very imaginatively. Right? Now, all this if you put together, it's very clear that demilitarization has been done to a large extent, which is now being admitted by Ukrainians themselves. The other two, war termination conditions of, Donetsk and Luhansk to be recognized as independent states and Crimea to be recognized as part of Russia, that has been done by the traditional role. So this is what I said, the tactical, the operational and the strategic have been linked. Now I'll just touch on two innovative uses of firepower which I found fascinating. The Ukrainians did a firepower ambush where they allowed the Russian convoys to come in and they designated it and used long-range firepower with the surveillance elements to destroy them. That was, I thought, very good, and we have a lot of value in this in our own system. And then the Russians have done a track and kill of enemy firepower by, firing on the Ukrainian launchers whenever they opened up, then tracking them through the drone and hitting the hides. Again, a lot of lessons. With this, I'll hand you the thing back to General KJ, and I'll come back with lessons.
Very rightly, you have linked up the stated objectives and then what has been achieved and how firepower or attrition has played a very large role. And I hope in the next part you will also bring out aspects of use of air power, heliborne ops which were attempted and could not be executed properly. So let's now go on to Jan Satish Dua, who is an expert in urban warfare, and he'll also touch upon the training aspects if there are any shortcomings in the way people are fighting. So thank you, Satish. Over to you.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here in an online version of the Millet Fest. As General Shankar, briefly went over the political aims, let me actually start with what were the likely military aims, because that will help us understand what I want to discuss. When I say likely, because the political aims were stated upfront, but likely military aims is something that we can infer. Some that flow out of the political aim, and some in some part by seeing the war unfolding over 1 month. The underlying thought, as General KJ also briefly alluded to it, is that it is easy to conquer, but it's tough to hold what you conquered. In experiences of Vietnam, Afghanistan, Mosul, and many others show that urban areas, fighting in urban areas is a great equalizer. So with that in view, in my view, let me hazard a guess, so the likely military aims were perhaps to capture maximum area east of Dnipro River. Because you see that they have not actually forayed much to the west. Siege of cities. No capture. Siege of cities, I'm repeating that, of Kiev, Kharkiv, and several other cities, because they don't want to risk urban warfare. And that is where you see, whether it's tanks or missiles, they're not investing themselves very much. They've just gone on to some suburbs, but not driven inside to the heart of the city, where they're bound to get more attrition. Next. Also, one more point. It is also because of that there has been minimal damage to cities or people. Let's not get carried away by what we're seeing on channels, because they're only showing, because it's good to show what destruction has taken place, the human stories. But the fact is, overall, when such big, beautiful cities are involved, there has not been so much damage in pure corridor with Donbass. And lastly, to capture Odisha, to deny access to the sea. Having said this, if these were the likely military aims, what are the lessons that we pick up? First, they are operating, the Russian 41st Army Group is operating in battalion groups, and rightly so, because they are not indulging in large maneuvers. They are actually coming on to several cities. But I think one lesson that we can learn is that they opened up too many fronts. More than 15 major cities have been addressed in one way or the other, or to different degrees. So, and the western part, the west of Ukraine, has not been addressed at all. Especially, also the 5 bordering countries have not been addressed. NATO has been taking advantage of that. So you've got an isolated battlefield, which is part of what you want to achieve. Secondly, you left the western flank totally free. Air has been flowing in. The army has got operation space there, and the refugees are going on. Well, refugees, migrants is not concerned, because Russians don't want to stop them anyway. What I'm trying to say is that Russian military, by the kind of military might it has when compared to Ukrainian military, should have overwhelmed by the use of superior weapons, modern platforms, and so on and so forth. Their weakness is in inadequate infantry. General KJ mentioned this. And what little infantry we see has come in their infantry carrier vehicles. Because if you have to get to towns and cities, the built-up areas, you require more boots on ground. We've seen more tanks. We've seen more firepower. So we will really have to analyze as a second thought once the operations are over. Maybe then we will get a full measure of what they set out to do and what they could achieve or not. We are seeing many weaknesses in the Russian military. Several myths are being broken. The maintenance of their tanks, I'm sure General KJ will agree, maintenance of their equipment raises a question mark. There were so many breakdowns. There were so many places where they got stuck. So logistics is being covered separately, but I just want to make a mention of this. They have their training standards leave a lot to be desired. Because most of them are conscripts. So it is showing, these effects are showing. And then there are essentially people of the same stock. Whenever they come across, Ukraine people have risen up, citizens have risen up against a tank or a vehicle, and they move back because they don't want to create the situation. So on one hand is that human angle of the same stock of people. On the other hand, you had conscripts. A couple of them were caught taking PWs, and they said they did not know what they were here. Initially, they had come with a different mission, and so on and so forth. So we are seeing that their basic tactics, there are gaps in their basic tactics. And when you have this kind of infantry predominant operations that are needed to invest in cities, to invest in built-up areas, because they are the ones. These are the areas which will actually have to be cleared street by street, house by house, mohalla by mohalla. But to do that, you really require troops which are very trained in doing that. So we are looking at tactics, training, techniques. And in my view, there is a lot to be done over there by a military machine like the Russian army. Next, General KJ General Shankar mentioned this, integration of different elements. I would say integration of the air and the ground forces into a joint force, that should have been done. I feel that there is scope for improvement over there. We expected very swift operations. The Russians, the world expected the operations would be swift, and they also expected perhaps where they would invest towns and built up areas, that Ukraine would capitulate sooner. Well, that didn't happen. There were also expectations that the Russian-speaking people will rise up and will help the Russian military. That also did not happen to the extent. I mean, there may have been isolated cases, but by and large, that did not happen. So there is a lot to be learned during this war, but my view is, and I've been saying that from the beginning, that I don't think Russian military is actually serious to get inside the towns and cities. The Ukrainians are actually waiting for them. They are goading them. They want them to, Ukrainian military wants them to come inside and trap them. But they don't want to come in. That's seen by their progress. They don't want to come in. They cannot come in. They don't have adequate infantry. I'll rest my opening remarks and opening intervention here. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Jaldua. Some very valid points. And highlighted that ability to take casualties, to accept body bags coming back, is becoming a big question mark. China, after the Galwan thing, was also shaken up. Here we are looking at a scenario Russia may not be ready to accept casualties. Their troops may be not with the kind of gusto or daredevil approach that is required to capture cities. So the larger question that many of our panelists may like to take on is that is it sending a lesson that kinetic operations have a limitation unless you have capability to take the casualties? And will it lead to a more stable order? Let's see, after all, in this war, Russians may read, but it is a stalemate. Is stalemate the reason to start a war? Do I start a war and accept and redefine my objectives? Some questions we can look at it. I thought I'll sound because he's ideally eminently suitable as a historian to look at. So join the discussion, please.
Sorry, am I on next now?
Yeah, you can be heard, Peter.
Okay, sorry. Yeah. Well, thank you very much for the invitation to join you. And I come here with several credentials, one of having worn uniform in the British Army as a regular and as a reservist, but also as a historian who has looked at, most recently at city fighting and this kind of conflict during the Second World War. But also I must declare that I know Ukraine very well. And I've visited many of the cities and the countryside with which we're dealing. And I want to make 3 points in this first session. The first is that we are used to fighting and theorizing and teaching joint warfare. And what we're seeing in Ukraine is not joint. What we have is a land war, there is a maritime element, and there is an air war which is being fought completely separately. And what we seem to see is a lack of integration of those different aspects. And others, like the cyber war particularly, which doesn't seem to have manifested in the way that we all expected it would. So in terms of joint warfare, what we expected is not transpiring. And we can explore the reasons for that a little later on. The second is in terms of a unified command. This campaign with its different axes is being fought by different military districts of the Russian Federation. And instead of one unified command, there seems to be 4 separate from the central, southern, Western and Far Eastern military districts. And each of those has come with a slightly different nuance of doctrine and force balancing. In addition, the southern elements are incorporating aviation, airborne, and maritime and marine elements, which the others are not. So what we've got is a campaign that's being fought in different ways from different axes by different commanders, and you're almost going back to a Napoleonic era where the doctrine revolves around that of the commander of personality rather than training. And I think that's worth exploring a little later on. Because I'm dealing with logistics, the final point I want to make here is that the Russians have gone into this campaign logistically unbalanced. And they went in because of both my predecessors, the generals, have referred to this. The original aim of the campaign was the liberation of what was regarded as ethnic Ukraine, ethnically Russian Ukraine. And so in the most optimistic of scenarios, the Russians were not intending to fight. And therefore, when they advanced to contact, expected to be met with garlands of flowers and so on. And clearly that hasn't happened. But if your principal aim is to enter a country and liberate it, then you expect the locals to provide some of your logistics needs. And therefore, and speed, of course, is the name of the game. And the overall aim would have been to Kiev to remove that government, replace it with your own. So to achieve that, the Russian Federation appears to have gone in all the military districts, logistics light, sacrificing logistics for speed, and hoping to make up the balance with what the local population will give them, and possibly the local military forces who will surround up, possibly go over to their side. And of course, the opposite happened, and Russia found herself, each military district in turn, logistically unbalanced. Now, we would expect after about 3 weeks anyway in any kind of military operation, and I was the UK historian for what we called Operation Telic, what the Americans called Operation Iraqi Freedom. So I was there in headquarters whilst that was going on, exactly 19 years. And after about 3 weeks of advancing, you would expect an operational pause anyway, rotating your forces, and more importantly, bringing up your logistics. And that hasn't really happened until now. And the need for a logistics pause was obviously much, much earlier in the campaign. Once the Russians had realized that the liberation had turned into a war of conquest, that was the moment at which they needed to rebalance. But that decision, and I'm not sure why, we can explore that, was not taken. And so we've had all the logistics difficulties that we've seen and discussed so widely in the international media. One other point, and I think it was General Satish who mentioned this. The most important part of this at the operational level is being fought in Donbass. What is being reported, because it's good television, are the city fights and the battle for Mariupol. The most significant battle is in the Donbass, and that's where the vast majority of the Ukrainian armed forces, the professionals rather than the volunteers and conscripts, are fighting and holding the Russians in check. That's the most significant, but it's not very televisual. But from our point of view, this is where the lessons will come from. And this is in due course when the war is over, however, whenever. That is the theatre I think we'll probably need to explore most, because that is peer versus peer. That is two armies equipped largely with the same equipment, who started off with the same doctrine, and we will see how one side or the other gain advantage and why. And that's my final point in this round, is that, of course, in 2014, the Ukrainian army and the Russian armed forces were pretty evenly matched, not numerically, but in terms of background and doctrine. They were both Soviet-era forces, equipped with the same range of equipment and mostly the same range of equipment that you yourselves operate today. The land grab of the Donbass and the land grab in the Crimea woke up the Ukrainian army, and they started to be trained by the United States and the United Kingdom. And whilst they didn't change their equipment, they changed their doctrine. And what has happened since 2014 is the Ukrainian army has moved on and been given more of a Western mindset in terms of fighting capability, fighting power, mentality, if you like. Whereas the Russians have stood still. They did very well. And of course, if we look at the wars that the Russian Federation have been involved in, whether it's the Donbass, whether it's Chechnya, whether it was Georgia, or whether it was in Syria, those are a completely different kind of war. And certainly not the peer versus peer conflict spread over huge areas of terrain, requiring massive logistical sustainment that they've suddenly in the territory of Ukraine. So this is a war for which they were not prepared, and yet certainly I and most of the rest of the world were guilty of buying into the Russian propaganda surrounding their army of a huge organization, which now proves, I think, in some respects to have been hollowed out. And therefore, they were trading on a reputation rather than the reality. But that was never revealed because the areas they fought in recently are much smaller. They're almost bushfires. Thank you, General.
You've touched on all the relevant points. See, one aim of Russians was demilitarization of Ukraine. So they've destroyed all the famous military industrial infrastructure plants, like the Antonov plant. They have destroyed the gas turbine factory, and they've also damaged the marine craft building facilities, which are closer to Black Sea ports, Mariupol and other areas. So, and on the other hand, there is training which in any case, Ukraine had chosen to start training with the Western nations. There is this partnership project which was going on. So it's a moot point after the war. Now who's going to rebuild that infrastructure? Because there is certain amount of know-how, certain amount of know-why. So how is it going to be resuscitated? Will the Western nations move it? The questions, we all have to look at it. And Peter has also touched on a very interesting aspect of pauses in the battlefield. There is this operational pause when you execute one operational cycle, which could be 5 to 7 days, and there could be a logistics pause, which is forced on you because of the logistical challenges. And there is this concept of culmination point, readers, which is the final point where you run out of your capability. So do ask yourself these questions as you analyze this campaign, that have Russians reached their culmination point or near their culmination point? Did they sequence their operational pause properly? Did they plan on their operational cycles as they happen? Or has this logistic pause constrained them? These are all very valid posers. I'll not answer all of them because I'm also trying to find some answers. But let me go on to a seasoned journalist, Praveen Swami, who's a great expert in analyzing conflicts in India. And listeners, do appreciate the fact that Praveen is fighting a family challenge. And despite that, he's chosen to make time for you. So here is my friend Praveen, who despite his constraints is joining us to give us his perspective. Over to Praveen.
Thank you, General. Thank you for the kind words. And it's a pleasure to be with my esteemed fellow panelists and to have this opportunity to speak to you. My favorite military history story involves the Battle of Megara in 424 BC, which some of you on this panel will be aware of, but just for our audience. And the story so goes in some Roman accounts written much after the battle, of possibly not great authenticity, but still a fabulous story. That the Megarans were besieged by far, far superior forces, which included battle elephants, the greatest siege weapons of their time, and had no means to break this siege. Whereupon, with great cunning, so the story goes, they rounded up some pigs, covered them in fat, and set them on fire, and pushed them towards the battle elephants. And these squealing, burning elephants panicked the elephants, which, these squealing, burning pigs, panicked the elephants, which broke ranks, trampled on the army, leading to a great victory for an inferior army. Now, the point of the story is, of course, not about pigs or elephants, but showing that in wars through history, the smart side has won, not necessarily the more powerful one. And I just wanted to preface some of what I'm going to say with that observation. It had been widely expected, and there's a large genre of literature, that the next war in Ukraine, the one we're seeing now, would be somehow different from all preceding wars, in that it would involve something that's become fashionably known on the think tank circuit as 5G warfare, or a form of warfare that was fundamentally non-kinetic, that it involved things flashing on computer screens, with, things playing out in cyberspace, but not very much blood and gore. In fact, that hasn't happened. The sort of model that was held out in a lot of literature were the 2015 cyber attacks on Ukrainian power infrastructure, which, if I remember correctly, cut some power off for some 250,000 people. But again, nothing of that kind has really happened. Microsoft's Threat Information Center, which monitors these things quite closely, has looked at cyber attacks, and there have been hundreds of those as of date, touching on all kinds of things, the usual suspects. So there have been distributed denial of service attacks, which are fairly crude and try to overwhelm the server system by pinging it repeatedly. There have been worms and Trojans that wipe data, various other kinds of things, but nothing has had any kind of very substantial impact on the logistics or infrastructure, in fact, of either country. There's been some clever stuff. The Ukrainians, for example, have adroitly posted war propaganda of various kinds, including photographs of dead soldiers or identity cards from prisoners of war onto Russian servers to try and neatly bypass the information blockade Russia has imposed on its own population. But actually, this does not seem to have had a great strategic impact, even in Russia, one way or the other. If nothing else, I think one of the lessons that we should take away from Ukraine is that the next fashionable theory of war, 4G warfare, 5G warfare, should not seduce us into not thinking about wars of the future as they have been in the past, as something that will involve the exercise of military force and bloodshed. This idea of neat wars of the future where decisive victories can be secured, non-kinetic means was an illusion and will probably remain an illusion. The second thing I'd like to go on to is a little bit about thinking about propaganda, because this is something that has been a growing subject in Indian military debates of over several years now, particularly with our concerns over counterinsurgency and to do with Pakistan and China. One of the suppositions is that propaganda is part of a spectrum of something called information warfare, and that it is a thing that has vast influence on populations. This is in reality a fairly untested proposition. In fact, we have a long history of people using propaganda to influence opinion. Generally, nation states have been most able to influence propaganda within the territory that they control, and fairly effective at molding public opinion. Public opinion, moreover, is acutely sensitive to reality on the ground. It is transmitted through 101 means, including word of mouth, the testimony of soldiers returning from the front, other means of communication which are non-formal. And what we've seen in Ukraine and elsewhere is that these kinds of non-formal means of communication seem to have been as powerful in shaping opinion as any sort of wizardry on the internet. In Russia itself, I'm sad to say, but Russian friends tell me that Vladimir Putin's effort to shape the narrative among his own constituency have been fairly influential and successful using fairly blunt instruments. Ukrainians have been extremely successful in reaching out to the rest of the world, in convincing the world of their case. They seem to have had somewhat less success within Russia itself, despite their nimble information operations. My takeaway from this is that probably in thinking about warfare, we should concern ourselves a little bit less with molding opinion and possibly a little bit more with events on the ground. For example, the behavior of troops amidst a hostile population will be far more influential in building opinion than anything you might put out on social media or the internet. A third lesson I would take away from this is looking at the unexpected and unpredictable ways in which this war has panned out, to look a little more dispassionately at our capabilities within India to study and analyze wars. It pains me somewhat to say this, but the corpus of military history production within Indian universities, academia, and among the military community has been anemic for many years. It's a matter of deep regret, for example, that we do not have a corpus of scholars and experts who will be looking at what is happening in Ukraine and Russia today on ground and producing scholarship of real value in the coming 4 or 5 years. For that matter, even looking back, the corpus of work we have on our previous wars, all the way back to our contrasting success in the Eastern and Western theaters in 71, or the War of 1999, leave alone 62, is quite limited. And one of the things to take away from this war is that where there is an ecosystem that is able to learn from experience and to draw appropriate lessons, that country does better. The Ukrainians have definitely learned from their own unsuccessful efforts in the last war and significantly adapted their warfighting techniques and their doctrines. The Russians, on the other hand, as Dr. Caddick Adams pointed out, did not draw appropriate lessons from their campaigns in Georgia and the last Ukraine war. Open systems where information is debated, where study is rigorously conducted, prosper. And that's probably one takeaway also for us from this campaign. The last lesson I'd like to draw is about intelligence. And there's no doubt to my mind that one of the things that's contributed significantly to the Ukrainian campaign, I can go into this further in the next round of questions, are intelligence capabilities that are highly focused and highly professional. Sadly, in India, despite the lessons of the 1999 war, our investments in capabilities in our intelligence community have been limited. While we've spent a fair bit on enhancing our technical capabilities, our investments, for example, in area specialization and language skills across the covert services have been extremely limited. I sometimes joke with friends that even if we get a machine tomorrow that lets us listen to Xi Jinping's bedroom conversations, we don't have the corpus of specialists and experts who will really let us entangle and unentangle and understand that. So some lessons learned, I think, for India here. and I hope we can flesh these out further as the conversation proceeds ahead. Thank you.
Thank you, Praveen, for flagging very appropriate trends. Now, what we'll do is we are running short of time, so I'll quickly get into round two, and I'll cover my part related to mechanized forces and maneuver. As I relate to India, the foremost concern that I have is when Russian Republic Soviet Union collapsed last time, and there was migration of technical talent and production facilities. The country which exploited that the best was Israel. Israel took away plants to manufacture ammunition, and FSDS, APS ammunition plant was taken away, and India bought that ammunition from them. My question through you, viewers, and through my co-panelists is India thinking on these lines? In Ukraine, there are a large number of people who have the know-how and know why. There are people like Jan Shankar who are actively working with DRDO. Are we looking at getting some of them? Can we get them? And kickstart our DRDO. The first poser that I pose in context of India. The second one is there that I am very sure that this is not the end of the tank. India recently rushed tanks to Ladakh, used them in Kailash operation. Tanks have their own role, but we have to really recalibrate our objectives. We cannot look for objectives like Rahim Yar Khan or Murid K. They are well out of our reach. We have to look at shallow objectives, and our hierarchy has done the right thing by activating integrated battle groups. So those battle groups, I am sure, will get to those shallow objectives. We have to retain faith in our equipment. Indian man behind the gun is great. Why I say this? In 65 war, Pakistanis were given the latest tanks, patterns, with coincidence range fighters. They had these optical devices. If you watch my hands, they had to be manipulated like this to get a stereoscopic view of the range. They couldn't figure it out. But Indians found a great technique, 3-round technique, with an old tank like Centurion. Add one, drop off, and we made a graveyard of pattern tanks. So Indian crew, I am very confident of. We know how to exploit our equipment, and only caution I have is all these people who root for tour of duty, take people on contract, let us have these, kind of things like take for short employment. Please watch out. We've seen it in the operations which China tried to execute, and we are now seeing it in the Ukrainian war. Have regular army, volunteer army, it will do you good. You can have a leaner army, but don't experiment. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. That is my advice on that account. I would also like to highlight the fact that we have chosen our campaigning season properly. We haven't got into mud swamps ever. Even in Bangladesh, 65 war, we sequenced it, though at the tail end of monsoon, it was done after the crops had been harvested, so that we don't have a famine in our country. It was a great idea in 65 war. We could have done it during monsoons also, though the ground would have been made it more difficult. Similarly, in 71, Manekshaw took a call, and he did these operations only when passes were closed and it was possible to execute them. So we'll have to choose our campaigning season again properly and execute our operations according to those. And final thing that I would like to say is that we are now looking at wheeled APCs or ICVs. We have to have a good mix of agile platforms which can utilize marginal terrain so that they can get off the road, execute the maneuvers. Because for a tank man, it is very distressing. Actually, I am very distressed. I feel very offended that you employ such large formations and deny them the maneuver? Maneuver is what gives you shock and awe. It also gives you protection. It also gives you your objectives. So whatever India does, it has to keep in mind that we cannot employ mechanized forces where there is no maneuver. There may be tight maneuvers, shallow maneuvers, limited maneuvers, but maneuvers will have to be there. So with this, I'll pass it on to Jan Shankar for round two, please.
Thanks a lot, sir. I think there are a few interesting issues which have come up. The first thing is this issue of maneuver itself and what we expected the battle to unfold the way and what has happened. One thing I'm very clear, the next war will not be a 5G war, nor will it be a maneuver-oriented war. It has to be something different, and this is the thing which has come out. Firepower-based war. And I'll substantiate that. I also feel, and this is my view which I have been developing, the next war, especially in our context, will be one of a deep battle with shallow objectives. I'm telling something new, right? And this is something which is a mind game which we have to change. You need to think of firepower as a deterrent, which we have not thought of so far. We've always used firepower for the close battle and never thought of the deep battle. When I say we've not thought of it as a deep battle, we've not thought of it as an integrated manner. We've not thought of it as a theaterized manner. And that is what our next CDS and theater commanders must do in future. Because in a Sino-Indian context, control of the depth communication systems, as you would know, General KJ, the communications of along the north and the western and the eastern express highway, you control them, and the battlefield is controlled at strategic levels, right? So that means we need to develop deep battle concepts suiting our terrain with communications and networking suitably, which don't get disrupted during battles. Then you need to think of how you overcome terrain friction of Himalayas by long-range vectors. That's very important. That's a great lesson which I have learned in this campaign, because I am not expected, like we said, all great maneuvers to happen during Rapustita. It was known. After all, the gap between Manstein's backhand plan and the Battle of Kursk for 6 months was due to Rapustita. Otherwise, Kursk would have been taken and the history of Second World War would have been different, right? That's a major thing for us. The reach of long-range vectors have to be exploited more imaginatively. And that pins deterrence as a very important concept which we don't have in our thinking. Right. The next thing is, in our context, this is fine. This is a battle between a nuclear nation and a non-nuclear nation. In our case, we have both nuclear nations, both sides. So the entire spectrum of conflict is going to be bandwidthed. I mean, in my assessment, I might be wrong, right? The way I look at it, based on historical evidence, Kargil conflict gives you one end of the battle spectrum of the threshold of violence acceptable. And the Eastern Ladakh, where we just fought with, fundamental right control stuff, is the other spectrum. And any future war will be in this spectrum. I don't know whether we will cross this spectrum. Within this spectrum, how much are you going to maneuver? How much are you going to develop deterrence? How much are you going to destroy? Is a big question which we have to think, because it's in this spectrum, before it crosses that threshold, we have to achieve victory or defeat or stalemate the way we want. Right. I also feel that we need to revisit the concept of firepower as a support system in battle. And this is a national problem, which our previous CDS very nicely put it out on the TV. Right? It's a mind game which we have to really think. Okay. The major issue which General KJ has brought out, and I agree with him, is how do you get, this kickstart Atmanirbharta in the right manner? If their whole story is destroyed, the capability of Ukrainians, can we get the Ukrainian know-how and knowledge into our system and integrate them? Why I say this, and I think that's a very valid thing, it's not only Israelis, even the Chinese have taken a lot of know-how. I know for a fact that India was offered this know-how when the Soviet Union was disintegrating. And very unfortunately, due to bureaucratic stupidity at that point of time, I am aware of that, we couldn't get this. I only hope we don't repeat this mistakes, right? And that I think is a very, very valid point. And I think people in Delhi must really think of this in a great manner. Okay, I've spoken of fire ambushes and track and destroy operations. These are tactical lessons, I think, which we need to learn and imbibe because it demands a great amount of coordination between various arms and services, which we today really lack. I'll give you one observation of what we learned in Kargil, right? And probably have forgotten and got revived when I did all this. In fact, I've written this also. I've written the Pakistanis gained renown when their artillery was used imaginatively in Kargil and was prime on the battlefield because that was the time when they cut off the National Highway 1 Alpha with prehistoric 5.5-inch guns used imaginatively. And they achieved infamy when they ran short of firepower. That was when they were finished off, if you look at it objectively. We gained infamy initially when artillery was inadequate and relegated to a sideshow due to inaccurate assessment. And this is historic. Okay, it was only when our artillery was brought in big numbers and it was restored to its prime importance on the battlefield that India could gain renown and victory and redress the situation. Today, that was 20 years back artillery. Today, we have to think of firepower in a more synergistic and integrated manner. When I think of firepower, I start from that little guy who's carrying a shoulder-fired system, right to the Rafale and everything in between. We need to think of this very seriously. With this, I'll rest my case. And any questions, I'll take them on at the end.
Thank you, Jan Shankar. Let me quickly pass the discussion to Jan Dua for taking it forward, please.
Thank you, sir. Let me begin by drawing some parallels between the context over here that we're talking about and our context. The striking coincidences that strike me are in 1971, we realized that the center of gravity was Dhaka and we went for it. We bypassed many other population center decisive points and went for the center of gravity. As I mentioned earlier, that here they have stretched themselves, the Russian military has stretched themselves too thin. So many towns, Kiev in the north, Kharkiv in the east, south, apart from the coastal region, Mariupol onwards, coastal region, planning for Odisha. So they've stretched themselves too thin. I think General KJ mentioned this point himself also. It was mentioned that we timed our operations very well in 1971. As is very famously known that it was General Manekshaw who suggested that the operations be held for a better time, so we did not run into swamps, muddy waters, etc. In Operation Gibraltar, we had Pakistan hoping that the Kashmiri population, in 1965, the Kashmiri population will rise up in revolt and they will help the Pakistan military. And it did not happen. In a very similar manner, the Russian-speaking people have not really risen up in revolt in any significant manner to help the Russian military. General Shankar just alluded, though he was talking in a different context, but he mentioned to restricted use of air power. Now here also the air power, you spoke of restricted use of air power in Kargil. We did not allow our air, we did not allow our military army also to cross the LC. There were different political considerations. Here also we see a restricted use of air power and the militaries learned to their peril. We also could have sort of scaled down our casualties had we allowed a free hand to the air. What then are the lessons for us out of this? First, I think it has been brought out, I'm not the first one to speak of that, but we need to rethink our kinetic warfare, the importance thereof. We've always been saying, all right, now the next wars are going to be hybrid and then we will have cyber, space, all that will step in, that's fine. But then boots on ground will still count. Next, integration rather than joint forces. I think, should be the mantra. We've all spoken about it. Peter also mentioned, and we spoke about the fact that here we're talking about a separate air warfare and a separate land warfare and a separate sea element in the south. We need, and especially as we, Indian military, has embarked on this journey of integration very recently, we need to take the right lessons and integrate them. We also need to integrate, if I may use the word, irregular mixed with conventional as far as hybrid warfare is concerned. Application of platforms versus the PGMs. We've seen that difference over here. We need to draw lessons in our own context from that. General Shankar did mention about PGM and he said everything in between. But then we need to understand what will work where. But nothing can be discarded. Everything has its own value, given the time and space. This war underscores for us, as always, the need for Atmanirbharta. Peter, I'm talking Atmanirbharta is the thing that we're talking about. It's essentially Hindi word for self-reliance, because we saw when the surgical strikes, after surgical strikes, when we wanted to be ready for any contingencies, to fill up our critical voids, after devolving emergency powers to the vice chiefs, it took us actually 1.5 to 2 years for things to fetch up, despite we having bought from the foreign OEMs under the emergency powers. So in Atmanirbharta, General KJ has already mentioned, and General Shankar also alluded to it, taking advantage of the situation, we can actually, since we are from the Soviet stables, both Ukraine and Russian, both the countries will offer us some advantages. We need to be nimble-footed to take advantage of that. And last 2 points. One, information warfare. Russians have not been able to use that well. Whatever be the reasons, they themselves denied their population. The Western countries' own platforms have also restricted their use to them. Some of it Russians have done. So all that put together, their information warfare story is not been good. We need to take a positive lesson from that. A lesson from how Ukraine has managed information warfare. We need a strong narrative which should be boldly and effectively told. The larger point I would end with this is this. Here we see, and I'm just rephrasing, you can agree, disagree or agree with that, but we are seeing an army or military based largely on military conscripts at the lower level. We are also seeing a leadership which is perhaps not that combat seasoned, the military leadership, and a dispensation which is totalitarian. So the leadership is not feeding perhaps the political leadership is not getting fully exposed to the ground realities. So is that the similar dispensation? Is China also in a similar boat? Does this give us cause for cheer? We need to be cautious, but then that should also be a matter of confidence for us. And I would agree with General KJ, though I myself have been votary of short-term soldiering, but today I do see the merits of regular, experienced soldiers as has been brought out in this war. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, General Dua. Before I go to Peter, let me do some kite flying. You know, in India, it's kite flying season. I read a very interesting story in this press that there are a group of people who are using all-terrain bikes and they are techies and they fly drones and they are coming out from nowhere, taking on the tanks and mechanized columns, and then again merging into the surroundings. Is there a case for us? We have scouts. We have Ladakh scouts, we have Gadwal scouts, we have Dogra scouts, we have Arunachal scouts, Sikkim scouts. Can we have a company? The large number of Indians who say, I want to join the armed forces. They want to, on Twitter you'll see so many of them are trying to earn Veer Chakras over there, thumping their chest. Follow the example of Ukrainians. They are doing crowdfunding. Can we put in some volunteers like that and put it in our scouts and then make it so difficult for Chinese elect as a deterrence even? So look at these possibilities, and thank you for giving me a chance to fly a kite. So I thought I must fly because I got enthused when I saw Satish Dua, who is one of the foremost motorcycle rallists in our country. So it gave me a sort of little lead into it. So Peter, over to you, please.
General Singh, I read that story too, and I was equally fascinated by the quad bikes. I think the first point I would like to make is actually, if you talk to the Ukrainian regular army, the professionals, they will tell you they've been at war since 2014.
Yes.
So they've had 8 years of this. And one of the reasons why I think they've been doing quite well in different domains and different fields is because they've bred resilience. They've already learnt some of the Russian tactics, particularly in the cyber war. I mean, all the Ukrainian response is because they've been fighting the Russian hackers and those from Belarus and wherever else for the last 8 years. And they've developed a lot of resilience. And that's, I think, one reason why the war in the ether in that domain really hasn't transpired and been as bad as we might have expected. But the same on the ground. So although there's been sort of train and protect going on, those tactics have been applied almost straight away in the Donbass, which is, as we know, has been an ongoing difficult war all the way for the last 8 years. And so, although this has come as a great shock to us, to the outside world, the Ukrainians and the Russians have already been testing some of their ideas. Now, if we come on to conscripts, the Russian army, I think, is a military force in flux, in change. They have made great efforts to move away from an all-conscript force. And 200,000 of their force are now what we would call regulars, and they have a regular contract that they sign. So a lot of these have been deployed. I think their problems, and we will all identify with this, is that they have no good, strong, intermediate level of command. They have no NCO cadre, as we would understand it. And that, of course, is the corporate memory of any armed force, where the older soldiers are passing on the tips for survival and all that corporate memory to the younger ones, and whether that's in a conscript force or a professional force. And that's their great weakness. And that means that their officers, and I'm sure we've all met Russian Federation officers, and they will all explain that they have far more duties and responsibilities because some of them at the lower levels are doing the job NCOs in our armed forces would be doing. So they're starting off with a great weakness, and that's a weakness that I think the Ukrainians have managed to iron out already, given that they have a smaller force and that they've been more keen to listen to, in this case, Western advice, but they would get that advice from any army in the world. So if I'm wearing my logistics hat, I'm actually a cavalry and tank officer by training. But if I wear my logistics hat, what are the similarities? Because you will be looking at the performance of the Russian-made equipment or Soviet-made equipment used by both sides, and how does that reflect throughout the Indian army? And the answer is, of course, you're procuring not just from Russia, you're procuring from a multitude of different countries, whether it's air, land, or sea. Whereas the Russians are only buying their own stuff. So their procurement and their maintenance and their logistics chain and their supply chain management is very weak because it revolves around only one country, their own. Whereas the Indian Armed Forces have got to be very smart because you're procuring aircraft from not only Russia, but France, and your transport aircraft from the United States. So all the supply chain issues and everything else that goes with training is much better, from my understanding, is far more resilient because you've not only spread the risk, but you've also actually had to incorporate elements of redundancy across the way, and the same with the army. you know, in terms of General Shankar, the artillery, your artillery tubes, you have procured from many different countries.
Oh, we don't have
Because of
any
that,
artillery from outside, incidentally. Let me tell you.
because of that, I think your resilience in terms of supply and logistics is much, much better as far as the Indian army is concerned, vis-a-vis the Russians, who just got into bad habits. And we've left out the kleptocracy that is the Russian Federation, where there is money going out of the military budget elsewhere. And that I see, well, the most obvious example is Russian soldiers begging for food even when they were on maneuvers in Belarus before the invasion started. So something tells me straight away that they're not being properly fed. Ration packs long out of date, and issues like that. So clearly they're starting from a difficult situation where their logistics were not geared up for the kind of military operation that they were mounting. We talked about culmination points and centers of gravity, and quite clearly Kiev was the center of gravity, and that hasn't been reached. And that was always probably too long a shot for the kind of campaign that this devolved into. And I think the final point I would make here, and we were talking about precision-guided munitions and a range of munitions that Russia is using. I'm not sure how large their war chest is. And I would have thought they would have had about 30 days of high-intensity campaign ammunition in the locker. And my sense is that not only are they drawing back from the cities because they want to try and surround the Ukrainian army in the Donbass, they must be running fairly short of ammunition, particularly artillery ammunition. We've seen nearly 2,000 cruise missiles fired, either from sea or mostly from the air. I don't know how many they've got, and I haven't read any papers on how many they've got, but that must be a fair proportion of what is in the locker, because of the rate at which they've been using it. And of course, Ukrainian air defense have been shooting down sometimes up to 75% of each salvo. So in terms of the munitions that are being used and the percentages that are hit, and of course the targeting hasn't necessarily been clever. If you're aiming at a shopping centre, that doesn't advance you militarily at all. So from those point of views, just from a logistics point of view, they started with the dice loaded against them, and that is continuing. And that operational pause, which needed to happen, and we were talking about this in my first session, probably at the end of week 1, has been forced on them now after 4 weeks. And you know, this will be the chance for them to shift the balance and battle on choosing of their own terrain, which is what has not happened so far.
Thank you, Peter. Let me now go to our friend Praveen Swami to make his comments. Try and restrict them to 3 to 4 minutes, please.
I'll be brief. The reason we're having this conversation and why all these observations are interesting is because, of course, India's fundamental strategic problem is no longer Pakistan. It's a superpower adversary, which has an economy 5 times our size, and between whom and us, the disparity is growing every year. I think sometimes we are in India prone to comfort ourselves by underestimating or underplaying the sheer asymmetry of resources. But what Ukraine has taught us is that an adversary who is asymmetrically powerful can be challenged if you do it the right way. What are the obstacles, though? And there are a few here. I heard about our need for technology, to indigenize technology. This is fantastic, but there are some obstacles in the way. The acquisition of high-end technology is not simply a question of importing factories or technology. It's about an advanced base of technologically competent personnel. It cannot be divorced from our wider academic ecosystem or from our wider ecosystem of advanced technology production. If you look at our deficits in things like pure mathematicians and physicists, quite frankly, they're appalling. And I'm surprised things like this don't even figure in our strategic conversations. We export the vast bulk of our competent computer professionals. There's very little effort to retaining the top end of professionals within India or providing them an ecosystem within which to function. I referred earlier to our chronic shortages in things like regional expertise and languages, even within our covert services. Those are again things which involve creating an ecosystem, investing in our universities, which we just are not doing. Final and quick point, I think it's very clear from not just the last defense budget, but from several years now of defense budgeting, that the political leadership has convinced itself that large-scale conventional wars are no longer a possibility in our region and will not be fought. Things, as you all know, have hovered around 2%, give or take, of GDP. We're already well behind on where the armed forces would like us to be in terms of expenditure. And there's probably a productive conversation to be had, given what's happened in Ukraine, about whether that 2%, which I fear very much is not going to increase, it's in the realm of fantasy to expect that it will, whether that 2% can be utilized in fundamentally more creative ways than trying to constantly catch up with the resources we need for ways of war fighting we simply do not have the resources for. I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you, Praveen. So we've had views from all our panelists, and it's time to take some questions. So may I request Radhika to help us to get the questions and connect us with people who are going to ask questions, so that we'll try and give them some answers, or we can jointly find answers to this.
Thank you, gentlemen. And with that, we come to the end of this excellent dialogue. Vital perspectives have been shared on various aspects of a war, the political and military aims, the surprises that got thrown up as the war progressed, logistical glitches and successes, tactics that were successful and those that failed, and lessons that should be learned in the Indian context thereof, from the war that's being fought as we speak. While we leave you with plenty to think about, I thank you on behalf of the Military Literature Festival Committee.
No, Radhika, are there any questions?
No, I don't see any, and I think we've run out of time as well.
Okay, just let me quickly then thank the organizers.
Yeah.
In particular, Mandeep Bajwa and others of Military Literature Festival. Let me also thank my fellow panelists for bearing with me, the timekeeper for you, and from people, Peter, who's so far but so near Ukraine, from Praveen Swami, who's overcome a family challenge to be with us, from my good friend Satish Dua and Shankar, Jan Shankar, both of whom are always in demand on various fora, yet they found time for us, and our great anchor for orchestrating it all. So thank you, viewers. My recommendations to you is, this story is not ended. It is still going on. And please pick up lessons and articulate them. And things like, many of you are on Twitter, LinkedIn, and social media platform. Do add your voice so that we can put up a cogent challenge. Because there are always concerns which are related to our own environment. So thank you. And Jai Hind, everybody.
Thank you and good night.
Good night.
Thanks a lot.
Jai Hind.